So good morning again, everyone. This is Dan Brown. I'm one of the senior hurricane specialists at the National Hurricane Center, coming to you from my home in South Florida. As you see up above, you should see all the other panelists as well. We'll introduce everyone here in just a couple of minutes. But this morning, we're very excited that you could join us for our Hurricanes at Home webinar series. And we're very excited to be reaching the folks in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands today. So again, welcome and thank you for joining us. We'll spend about 30 minutes, about half of our time this morning with a presentation. We're going to talk about hurricanes, the hurricane hazards, how we forecast hurricanes, and then following that, we'll take some time for your questions. And there is a box you should see on your panel screen that will allow you to type in questions, and we'll not only answer some of those questions during the webinar, but we'll answer some of those at the conclusion. Again, we'll have plenty of time to answer questions. I know we're expecting a lot of folks on this morning, so we may not get to every single question out there, but we'll try to do our best to answer as many as we can during our hour we have this morning. So again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to ask Robbie to move us to the next slide here. And again, as we introduce our panelists, we also, again, that we're focused today on Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And as you all know, your area is no stranger to hurricanes, unfortunately. Hurricanes are something that we have to be prepared for each and every hurricane season. If you go all the way back here to 1989, you'll see Hurricane Hugo there. That was one of the very devastating storms in Puerto Rico. And then in more recent times, and we've had hurricanes such as Irma and Maria that have also impacted the island. So again, we're going to talk about how we forecast hurricanes, hurricane science, how we observe the hurricanes, and then again, give you a chance to ask those questions. So with the next slide, we'll introduce all our panelists that we have here this morning. Again, my name is Dan Brown. I'm a hurricane forecaster at the National Hurricane Center. I'm also joined by Robbie Berg. Robbie's going to help me moderate the question answer period at the end. So good morning, Robbie. And then I'm also joined by Andy Latto and John Cangialosi. They're also both hurricane specialists at the National Hurricane Center. And they're going to be our presenters this morning. And then they'll also be our panelists as we look at the questions. And then lastly, we're have joined by a very special guest, Ernesto Morales. He is the warning coordination meteorologist at the National Weather Service office in San Juan. He's going to talk about what they do in San Juan and how we coordinate hurricane forecasts between the local office that provides that impact information for San Juan and the folks like us back at the National Hurricane Center. So thanks again for joining us, Ernesto, and we'll hear from you a little bit later as well. And you're also going to be around for the questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started right away, and we'll turn it over to John, who's going to take us through the first portion of our presentation. John, you might be on mute, so hang on just a second, see if you're muted.
Oh, I was muted. I apologize. Everybody hear me well now?
Can hear you fine.
Very good. Well, hopefully everybody listening today is excited to learn a little bit about hurricanes. I'm certainly excited to teach you about hurricanes. But before we talk about those specifically, those weather systems, I got a question for everybody listening. Do you know what a meteorologist is and what they do? Now, when most people think meteorologist, I think they think of someone on television telling you what the weather's going to be like today. And that could be a meteorologist, but a meteorologist is someone who studies or forecasts the weather. So if you have interest, oh, we lost, I apologize, everybody. So if you have interest in weather and you're really good at math and science, I think you have what it takes to be a future meteorologist. So please do keep that in mind. Now, specifically, we want to talk to you about what we do at the National Hurricane Center. And greetings from Miami, Florida, everybody. That's where the National Hurricane Center is located. I wish I could be in the building today showing you around, but hopefully this is the next best thing, and it still gives you an idea of what we do there. Now, I want you to take a look at these pictures here. This is the outside of our facility. And you might be saying, well, John, that's not a very pretty looking building. And I would say, yeah, you're right. It isn't very pretty, but it is very, very strong. The building is made of concrete and steel, and it's supposed to be strong because we're going to be working there even if a big hurricane comes to South Florida. Now, the National Hurricane Center has a really big job. We forecast tropical storms and hurricanes a really large area. So if those systems in Africa all the way into the Pacific Ocean to pretty close to Hawaii, the Hurricane Center is hard at work watching those weather systems. In addition to forecasting hurricanes, we have another big job. We tell boaters, big ships, and other people who spend time on the ocean what the weather's going to be like. So if you go on a cruise, or you know someone that works on an oil rig, or if you go just deep sea fishing, we're going to give you those forecasts to help keep you safe at sea, to tell you how big the waves are going to be and how strong the winds are going to be, to hopefully keep you out of those really bad weather conditions. Now, you might have also heard of the National Weather Service. And you might be thinking, yeah, I have heard of that. Where is the National Weather Service located? Well, the good news is the National Weather Service is essentially everywhere, scattered across the United States. And if today you're listening to us from Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands, I have really good news, as Dan mentioned in the beginning, because we have an expert for that area on the line with us today, and that's Ernesto. So I'm going to pass it here to Ernesto, who's going to tell us a little bit about what takes place at his office.
Hi, guys. Hey, first of all, thank you for the invitation to work along with you guys, talk about a little about hurricanes just before the season starts. We are the National Weather Service at San Juan Weather Forecast Office. Our main purpose there is to give the weather to the general public for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Therefore, we work as a team, not only in between us guys, we need information from the Hurricane Center just to relay information to our public and to forecast the impacts this track and this intensity of the storm will have, so people will understand what's going to be the story for us, what is going to be the impacts for us here. So mainly that's what we do. We also do the forecast, everyday forecast for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and the local waters. So you guys watch for the big wave. We also do that down here, and the strong winds, and for our boaters to basically do the mission that's protect life and property.
Thank you, Ernesto. And everybody, if you guys have specific questions about weather in the Virgin Islands or in Puerto Rico, please ask Ernesto. He'll be on the line with us for the next 45 minutes or so. So please ask questions. You can get to those at the end or in the question box. All right, let's specifically now talk about hurricanes. Now, what I want you to do, everybody, is take a look at this satellite animation of Hurricane Harvey that affected Texas a few years ago. And I want to analyze what a hurricane looks like from space. Now, when you're looking at this picture here, what catches your eye? I bet it's this big hole here right in the middle, am I right? That big hole in the middle is the eye of the hurricane. I bet you already knew that. But in the eye of the hurricane is a weird quiet, as it can actually get sunny in the eye, and the wind can almost become in the eye of really strong hurricanes. But I say it's a weird quiet because right around in this area here is called the eye wall, where the weather conditions are the worst, where the winds are the strongest, the rain is often the heaviest, and where the damage tends to be the worst. That's the worst place to be in a hurricane. On the eye wall in this area, right out here, is the rain bands. And the wind in the rain bands can be really, really gusty, and there can even be some tornadoes as well. Now, I want everybody to take a look at this, and I'm going to see if I can loop it again. I want you to take a big picture look with me. You can almost imagine for a second that the hurricane's kind of beautiful, right? It's almost amazing from space. Mother Nature really produces amazing things that builds all of our fascination about weather. But it's really hard to call hurricanes beautiful or amazing if one strikes your area, and I know you all know that. Now, how do we group hurricanes? You will probably know that we give hurricane names. And if you live in the island of Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands, you probably know names like Maria, probably Irma, as these really cause so much problems where you live. But we also give them groups, or what we call categories, through the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale, where a Category 1 hurricane has winds between 74 and 95 miles an hour, and a Category 5 has these tremendously strong winds of 157 miles per hour. Now, please keep in mind, this scale only tells you about the strength of the winds. It doesn't tell you about the other impacts and hazards that we're going to talk about later on. But we have to credit these two brilliant men for building the scale. Herb Saffir, who is an engineer, and Robert Simpson, a meteorologist. This scale has been around for decades and is still used today to communicate about hurricanes. Now today, I want to show you where these really big hurricanes go, really strong ones. The Category 3s, 4s, and 5s. We call those major hurricanes. Where do those track? Well, let's take a look together. Each one of the lines you see drawn here on the screen indicate the path of one of those major hurricanes. Where the lines turn yellow shows you where the storms were when they're at their strongest. Now let's take a look where those go. All across the Caribbean Sea, including where everyone here is listening to us from today. But you're not alone. They track into the Gulf of Mexico, across the Gulf Coast of the United States, Florida, and even up the East Coast of the United States. And guess what? Even to Canada. Yeah, even Canada. The bottom line, everybody, if the water's warm, then the hurricane has a chance of getting close to where you live. And certainly if you're listening to us today from Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands, you know the water is warm. So let's take a specific look for those locations. First, starting with Puerto Rico. Each one of the lines you see here indicate the path of a hurricane or a tropical storm. Where the lines are purple and red indicates where the storms were strong, and where they're yellow indicates where they were weaker. The bottom line is, history shows us that a lot of hurricanes track across that island. Most of them generally move from east to west. So always keep your eyes to the east when watching hurricanes. Let's take a look at the Virgin Islands now. Does it look different? Not too much. Basically the same. Lots of hurricanes in history as well. But once in a while, we also get storms that move from south to north across those locations. All right. Now, I think Dan mentioned this in the beginning. We're not going to let you completely relax during this webinar. We want to test hurricane knowledge. And given that a lot of you live in the hurricane belt or a location that sees a lot of hurricanes, I think you're going to do pretty well. Now, guys, this is a poll question, so we want you to actively vote. Once I finish reading this question, the poll will open and you can click what you think the right answer is. Are you ready? Here's the question. When is the Atlantic hurricane season? Do you think the right answer is A, May through November, B, December through April, C, June through November, or do you think the answer is D, all year long? All right, Dan has just opened the poll, and everybody feel free to vote.
So please vote, everyone. I'm watching the results come in. It's really neat to be able to see the votes get counted. And it looks like a lot of you have voted. More than half has voted now. Give it another 10 or 15 seconds. It looks like about 3/4 of you now have voted. So click those final answers, everyone. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And then let me see if I can share the results. I'm not sure that everyone can see them, so I'll read them here. But it looks like about 3/4 of you answered June through November, and then the other 20% said May through November. So the majority, John, said those two answers, and I'll let you tell them which one is right.
Sure, thank you, Dan. Okay, guys, so everybody, the correct answer is C, June through November. Congratulations to the majority. 74% got that correct. Way to go. And for the other 20% that said May through November, guys, that's a really good answer too. Lots of times we do see some storms form in the month of May. So really, I think, Dan, the majority, almost 95% of people got that right. So really way to go, everybody. And I'm not surprised given the location you live and how probably experienced you are with hurricanes. So what does it look like? When do we typically see all these storms? And what does it look like when we get really busy? Well, I wanted to show you a satellite picture from the month of September in 2018 and take a look at how many storms were scattered across the Atlantic basin at that time. Let me walk you through each of these storms. Here was Hurricane Florence over here over the Western Atlantic that went on to affect the Carolinas. This one here was Tropical Storm Isaac that went on to track westward into the Caribbean Sea. This one out here is Hurricane Helene that recurved over the Eastern Atlantic but could affect the Azores Islands. We also had another system here in the Gulf of Mexico that affected Texas and Louisiana, and yet another system off the coast of Africa that became Joyce over the Eastern Atlantic. Shows you how crazy busy it could be during portions of that hurricane season. And you might be, when are we the busiest? When should I be the most ready for hurricanes? Well, let's take a look at that. When do we really worry about hurricanes? Take a look at this campfire looking graphic with me. Now, whether you look at the yellow area, which just shows you hurricanes, or the red, which is hurricanes and tropical storms together, you basically get the same answer, that the peak in the season, or when we see the most overall, occurs right here in the middle of September. And the bottom line, everybody, is there's 3 months of the year that we want you to be the most ready for hurricanes. The months of August, September, and October are always the busiest. So don't be surprised if the hurricane season gets off to a quiet start. We're all hoping it does in June and July. Really, the busy time is late in the summer and toward the fall months. So be ready, especially ready for those months of the year. All right, on to our next hurricane quiz. Let's see if you could do as well this time. Now for this one, everybody, we are not going to ask you to vote. All I want you to do is think about the question and then just answer it in your homes. Are you ready? But no voting. What are the primary hurricane hazards? Do you think the right answer is A, high winds, B, storm surge, C, heavy rainfall, D, dangerous surf along the beaches, or do you think the answer is E, all of those? All right, just gonna give you a couple of seconds. The correct answer is, hopefully you're getting this one, it's E, all of the above. But the good news is, it's really all of them, right? So you couldn't have got this one wrong. Any answer really was the right answer. But the one we were actually really looking for was E, all of the above. So to help you remember these hazards, we got a little word to help you figure out all these specific hazards and not forget them. So the word's called swift. Now the S in the word swift stands for storm surge. Storm surge could be a huge problem. Now Andy's coming up next and will tell you exactly how storm surge works. But for now, know that that's the water that comes off of the oceans and floods neighborhoods where we live. What do you think the W stands for in the word swift? Yeah, it's wind. I'm sure you knew that. Everybody knows it's really windy in hurricanes, so you probably didn't have to remember that one. The I and the F stands for inland flooding, which if you live in Puerto Rico, you know how bad that can get with hurricanes, especially in some of the mountains. And the T stands for tornadoes, which could be a really big problem, especially in the hurricane rain bands. Now, in addition to the word swift, I also want you to remember one more hazards, waves and rip currents. Even if the hurricane doesn't make landfall in your area, and even if it moves far away from your area, you could still get really big waves and really rough beach conditions. So remember to make sure to pay attention to meteorologists like Ernesto or others to know when to stay away from the beaches, even if it's a nice day outside. All right, I got another quiz. Now for this quiz, everybody, I do want you to vote just like the first time, so get ready. Here's the question. Which hurricane hazard has caused the most deaths, unfortunately, across the United States? Do you think the right answer is A, wind, B, storm surge, C, flooding from the heavy rains, or do you think the answer is D, tornadoes? All right, guys, the polling is now open. Please vote. And from here, I'll talk to you guys later during the questions. I'm going to pass it to Andy.
Thank you, John. I'm watching again those votes come in. They're tallying up pretty quickly. Some folks I saw in the last one tried to answer in the question box, but if you can click on your screen where the poll is, it'll register in the votes. So I'll give it another 15 or 20 seconds here. About two-thirds of you out there have voted. And it's a really close race, I can see. So let me go ahead and close the poll. Looks like most of those votes have now come in, and then I will share the results. And it looks like here, flooding was our #1 answer, with nearly 40% of folks saying flooding. Number 2 was tornadoes, and third was a storm surge. Wind was pretty distant here with only 6%. So Andy, I'll turn it over to you and let you share the answers. And I know you have to take a second here to get the presentation back up, so we'll bear with us for a second. And you might be on mute, Andy.
Okay. Answer to the question, everybody. You can see my screen.
We can see it now, Andy. Yep, we're good.
All right. Okay, 18% of you said storm surge, 39% flooding, 37% tornadoes. The correct answer is storm surge. Most of you folks, though, between storm surge and flooding, overall, did get the answer right, because if you, and I'll get to that in a moment. So when I grew up, and I was your age, I lived kind of on a hill a few miles inland, and so the wind is what I thought about when a hurricane got close. I was thinking about boarding up the windows inside the house, and when the storm passed by, you'd have tree limbs down and whatnot. And so a lot of people think about wind. Water is what most people don't think about, but really should. The top left-hand corner of this image here, you see people being rescued in flooding waters. John mentioned the storm surge down below in the bottom left-hand corner where the water's moving inland. And so water is actually 9 out of 10 people die from water-related incidents, tropical cyclones. Storm surge accounts for about half of the fatalities. Rain inland flooding that John mentioned accounts for about a quarter of the fatalities. And another smaller percentage is caused by rip currents and drownings out at sea. Water is very important, and we're going to talk about some of these hazards here in the next few slides. So Hurricane Sandy, if you recall, was a large, sprawling storm that made landfall in New England, actually down the Caribbean Sea, and it reached the Manhattan area here back in 2012. So here's what it looks like in Manhattan on a typical day. Folks are walking around, there's vehicles driving around. Please pay special attention to this storefront here. When Hurricane Sandy made landfall, it brought the ocean waters inland. And you can see the water's a few feet high in these buildings and across these streets. This van's about halfway underwater. This car is most of the way underwater. So a lot of the folks were trapped inside their buildings as the storm passed by. So when you go to the beach and you are in the water, let's say you get hit by a wave that's a few feet high, it's easily big enough to knock you over. So what happens when storms make landfall, you have the storm surge and all that water rushing inland, pounding the areas as the water is moving inland too. You have very heavy weighted water moving, and it can cause homes to just come off their foundations. And in the picture here, homes have been moved several feet off their foundations. In fact, I'm not even sure where these houses originally were. What it goes to show you is how heavy water can be and how dangerous it can be with moving water. And that's why storm surge is so dangerous, because you can't necessarily down inside your home as one of these storms pass. We talked about flooding rain. So flooding rains is caused by rainfall. And so what happens is you have the runoff from heavy rainfall off your roofs and the ditches and everything, the lakes and tributaries. But if there's too much rainfall, the water has nowhere else to go, and it finds other locations. This is a good example. Tropical storm Allison. We're not even talking about a hurricane here. We're talking about a tropical storm that made landfall in Houston, Texas, and the heavy rainfall from it had nowhere else to go, and so it ended up flooding the Interstate 10 corridor there. And what you're looking at here is semi-tractors about halfway underwater. So this water is several feet deep just from a storm. As we say, tropical storms can be deadly as well because of the flooding rainfall. And also, tropical storms and hurricanes can produce tornadoes and waterspouts. So waterspouts, tornadoes, the difference between the two is the waterspouts are over water, tornadoes are over land. Yes, waterspouts can become tornadoes as they move from water to land. John also mentioned the waves and the rip currents. And so storm could be a few hundred miles away. It could be sunny skies. You could be out on the beach, great beach day. But the waves action picks up as the large storm offshore makes these large waves. And so as the swells move towards the coast, see in this bottom left-hand corner, the water splashes ashore and has to retreat between each wave. That can create a channel in the sandbars, which can create the rip current, and the water channel that pulls you out to sea. And that's what the is. You can get caught in that rip current and pulled out to sea. And there's different ways to monitor these. The Weather Forecast Office sometimes will rip current statement if there's hazards associated with rip currents. You can also sometimes, depending on the beach, have beach warning flags. So if you see yellow or red at the beach, it means those waters can be dangerous despite the fact it's actually nice weather outside. So we talked a lot about hurricane hazards, but how do we predict them? How do we know how big they're going to be, how strong they're going to be, and where they're going to go? So the first thing we do is look at all of these observations. We have surface observations on land. We have ships out there that are transmitting data back to us. There's buoys across the ocean. We have data. There's weather balloons that are launched across the United States twice a day that sample the atmosphere and tell us what's going on in the atmosphere. There's aircraft that can fly into those storms as well. And we also have satellites in outer space. In the bottom left-hand corner here, you can see basically these satellites are taking images, snapshots of what's going on below. And they do it very frequently. And so we can get an idea of the size, the location, and even the intensity of the hurricane just based on the satellite images alone. If the storm's close to the coastline, we have radar, which can help us dig deeper into the structure of the hurricane and monitor even for tornadoes inside the hurricane. Most of this data gets pulled into these very sophisticated computer models on supercomputers that simulate what they think the hurricane will become, how strong it might be, how large it might be, and where it might go. Our job at the Hurricane Center is to look at all of this data, decide what might be the good data, what might not be the good data, and which computer simulation might be most representative of what's going to happen. And yes, we do fly airplanes in the hurricanes. These are 3 different hurricane hunters here. The upper left is a jet-powered aircraft that typically flies around the storm, higher up in the atmosphere, that samples the environment to try to tell us what are the upper level winds like, what might steer the storm. The right and on below, the right-hand one here is a NOAA-owned aircraft, propeller aircraft that flies into the hurricane. And the one below is also propeller, an Air Force aircraft. They as well fly into the hurricanes. Those two on the right fly into the eye of the hurricane. And so the picture you see here on the right is what we call stadium effect, where in the eye here, the clouds are actually fairly low, fairly calm in the eye, and you're looking at the eye wall, the ring of intense storms around the center of the storm. And so what it looks like when you're in the center of the storm in the aircraft, it looks like you're in a football field looking at all the stadium seats. We call that the stadium effect. So this is a glimpse inside the Hurricane Center you're seeing. On the left-hand side are operations floors in the background behind that television screen, behind the folks doing the interviews. When there's a storm approaching, we have TV cameras set up, and they're doing media interviews on TV. We're also getting a bunch of phone calls for radio interviews, newspaper interviews to get out to you folks. We also are posting very frequently nowadays on social media to try to get the latest information to you. And so you can access that information at least as far as if you want to get information from our website, you can go to hurricanes.gov to get the latest forecast as well, in addition to all of these options here. Coming up in May, we have Hurricane Preparedness Week 2020. If you have questions such as what kind of supplies should I purchase for the upcoming season, am I in evacuation zone, where can I get all this information to try to track the storms, you can go to weather.gov/hurricane-preparedness. That link at the bottom of your screen there will get you one-stop shop location for all of this useful information. Now, what we're going to do now is we've been monitoring all your questions, and I'm sure they've been answering some so far. We're going to field some of the questions so all of us here can actually speak to you about some of the answers. So Dan and Robbie, if you have any questions for us, feel free to ask.
Sure, thanks, Andy. Appreciate that. And we've had some good questions. Again, I'll remind folks, if you joined us a few minutes late, that we now have about the remainder of our time, about half an hour here to really answer your questions. You can type those questions in the question box you see on your panel. We've gotten a lot of questions, and if you type them in English or Spanish, that Ernesto can help us translate if we get some questions in Spanish. But let's see, I'll try to ask one here from earlier, or someone was asking, Ernesto, maybe this one's to you. It talked about the fact, can we have a hurricane and earthquake at the same time? Let's hope not that would happen. But I know it's been pretty active in Puerto Rico lately. So someone's asking, what should we do, or how would we do anything different if that were the case? I'm not sure you have the answer, but I'm sure you're getting that question in Puerto Rico as well.
Something very curious is that during Hugo and during Maria, we had earthquakes. People ask us if they had earthquake during Maria because their houses were shaking. But the houses were shaking not because of the earthquake, it was because of the winds. So there are two different events, and that, yes, they can occur at the same time.
Thanks, Ernesto.
Yeah, so I saw a few questions on here. People were asking about how we name hurricanes. And so I thought I'd pass it on to John to talk about how we name hurricanes. And actually one person I saw asked, can we name it after a fruit? So maybe you can address that.
Okay, thank you, Robbie. Good question. So I'll start with the first part. How do we name hurricanes? Well, the names are a running list, everybody. So the names repeat every 6 years. And if you want to see what the names are going to be like this year for 2020, you can actually access it at hurricanes.gov, that first link that you see there. So the names are just available already, planned out ahead of time. You might notice that it goes from boy, girl, or girl, boy, and rotates. The names have different backgrounds, if you will. Some are Spanish, some are French, some are more American or English, based upon the countries where hurricanes and tropical storms, or these named storms, go. Now, I should mention that when a storm's really bad, like Maria was, that name gets retired because of how much damage and unfortunately how much deaths that storm produced. So that's where I think your question comes in, the second part. Then we replace the names that get retired. So the names get replaced through the World Meteorological Organization that talks about this as part of their workshop. And could it be named after a fruit? I don't think that's ever happened before, but if that name of a fruit is also a name that goes on, I can't really think of one off the top of my head. I don't know anyone named Banana, for example. But I'll say never, but it's never happened before.
Yeah, John, I was going to mention a pick on that aspect is that, while we don't use words like fruit, in the Western Pacific, they name their typhoons after things. So they don't always have names of people, but they name after things. So maybe out in the Western Pacific, they name typhoons after fruit. I don't know. We'd have to look at the list and see.
I didn't even know that, Robbie. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah, I love mangoes. I was thinking we have hurricane mango. I'm not sure that would be exactly right, but that's what I think of when I think of fruit. Hey, so I have a question here. It kind of goes along to some of what we were just talking about with the Western Pacific. I think the person here was asking mainly about the West Coast of the United States, but Andy, Kevin asked, are there any hurricanes on the West Coast? And I mean, I can answer that to say that no, we get them off the West Coast of of Mexico, the Hurricane Center also does forecasting for that area in the Eastern Pacific. We don't get them typically to go up into California and the western part of the United States because the waters are very cool out there. But I'll ask then you the question, what about the West Pacific and other parts of the globe? Where do we see tropical cyclones, we call them, and tropical storms elsewhere?
So yes, a lot of this is dependent on the ocean circulation, the ocean currents. So you try to picture the Atlantic Ocean, and you see when you picture the currents, you picture the currents kind of going from west to east in the tropical waters, and then up the U.S. coast, and then curves out towards Europe. And so all that warm water is moving up the eastern side of the United States offshore, and so that helps to fuel the hurricanes further north in the western Atlantic. Take the same thing in the Pacific Ocean, same kind of current where the warmer waters move north on the western side and the cooler waters move south on the eastern side. So you have these cooler waters being drawn south off the west coast of the United States. That limits to where the hurricanes can go without weakening because of the cooler waters. And so in the western Pacific, you typically have a lot of activity that goes all the way up to Japan, which is a lot further north than, let's say, like Southern California. So that's the main difference. And the same thing happens with the other areas around the world. It's a lot driven in where it's prone to based on water temperatures because of the ocean currents. So you see a lot less activity, let's say, on the west coast of South America, and a lot more, you can have more activity towards Australia.
Thanks, Andy. I saw a follow-up that I'll answer real quick before I turn it over to you, Robbie, and it said, are typhoons the same as hurricanes? And essentially they are. They're both what we call tropical cyclones. Again, typhoons occur in the Western Pacific, as Andy was just mentioning, whereas hurricanes are the same name for that weather system. They get their energy from that warm water in the Atlantic and then the Eastern Pacific. So, Robbie, I'll turn it over to you for the next question. See a lot of great ones coming in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. So next one I was going to pass to Ernesto. Ernesto, we saw a lot of questions already about tropical waves, and I'm actually impressed that everybody has heard of that term. And specifically, Mia asked, do waves also make floods? So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what a tropical wave is and the type of weather that you would get from one of those.
You know what? Tropical waves, strong tropical waves, can cause more damage than even the hurricanes in our case, because people are not expecting it. Tropical wave moves across the area every 3 to 5 days, and sometimes the conditions are really good and they can generate and produce a lot of rain. One example of this was 1985. Was during tropical wave that moved on and became a hurricane, a tropical storm, strong tropical storm. But it generated so much rain down here in the island for 3 days, straight days, because of the tail, or the moisture tail behind the system, that we lost over 100 people for landslides. So even a tropical wave, people tend to feel they're not that dangerous. They could be dangerous. And they're very common here in the island, and they're rain producers.
Thanks, Ernesto. I actually had another question to send your way. I thought this was a really good one, and it talks about the radars. And so the person was obviously aware of the radar that failed during Maria, that was destroyed by the storm. But they're asking how many radars are available in Puerto Rico. So how many monitors do you have at your office that you can use for forecasting?
Well, there's a difference. The radar is not owned by the National Weather Service, like in the States. Our radar are owned by the FAA. We have two. One of them is in Calle. That's the one who got destroyed during Maria. And the other one is the one in Toa Baja, next to the beach. So we got two radars, Doppler radars, that we can use to do our forecast.
Great, thanks.
So the next question, actually, I saw a couple of the same type of question I was going to pass to John. John, we had a couple questions about the airplanes. In fact, I think it was Layla and Samuel both asked about, have we had any accidents or have we lost any planes in hurricanes? So we do a lot of flying into these storms and you think it's dangerous. So how dangerous is it?
Yeah, the good questions, Layla and Samuel. First, I'll say that, I'm not really brave enough to be flying in the airplanes. I've only done it once, and I didn't really enjoy it. I'll say that. But we could talk more about that later. But surprisingly, they're pretty safe. These planes are, very strong planes. We have very talented pilots that fly them, and when they fly them, they often describe them as very bumpy rides. But relatively safe. Over the decades we've been flying, there haven't been that many incidents or crashes, and really, they really are pretty safe and a vital part of our jobs. So, for example, you might say, well, why do we still fly these planes into hurricanes? Well, the only way we really know how strong a hurricane is and all the information we need to know is by actually flying in there and collecting data. So if you're brave, I'll put this out there, if you're brave and you like roller coasters, and you like hurricanes, then maybe you guys can be hurricane hunters of the future.
Thanks, John. I have one here I'm going to send over to Andy. I think this is a really great question. One I don't think we've had asked yet. It says they don't recall hearing thunder or seeing lightning during Maria. Is this a common trait of hurricanes?
Yes, it is. When you get to the core of the hurricanes, it's very uncommon to hear thunder and see lightning. When you get to the farther outer rain bands, there is the chance of doing that. It just has to do with a lot of the temperature differences inside the structure of the hurricane. Let's see, a common thunderstorm have a lot of fast rising motion, but it's a very unstable atmosphere, even though it is unstable hurricanes. Kind of difficult to explain in this method, but an afternoon thunderstorm is you get these cells and these fast updrafts, and it gets to the freezing level quicker. And the hurricane is a warm core, and so it gets to that kind of level with that altitude. So it prevents really the electric charges from forming that would end up producing lightning.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So I had a sort of interesting question here. I thought that maybe I would take. Anna was asking can there be hurricanes in Europe? So that's a really good question, because you talk about hurricanes affecting the Caribbean and the United States, Mexico, Canada, but do they actually make it to Europe? And lots of times they can't, because the waters near Europe are just too cold. And so lots of times when a hurricane gets over there, they do tend to weaken. But what can happen is the hurricane can often transition to a winter type storm, an extratropical cyclone as we call them. And lots of times those storms can reach Europe. At the Hurricane Center, we talk to the weather services in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in Spain, and Portugal, because a lot of times those storms will still reach their shores and can still cause damage. Just because the storm changes what it looks like, it can still cause a lot of wind, a lot of storm surge, a lot of heavy rainfall, and cause damage. So we still do talk to those countries about storms that could reach their area.
Yeah, Robbie, if I could add something to that, if you don't mind. So if you're interested, whoever asked that question, great question. If you're interested, look up Hurricane Ophelia in Ireland. It knocked out it was during the apple trees where it really had all the apples on it. You'll see 1 million apples all over the floor that were knocked out from that hurricane's winds. It was not a hurricane when it affected it, but it looked and behaved just like one.
Thanks, guys. I was going to mention, I forgot to mention earlier, Ernesto, that this was the week that we typically hold the Caribbean Hurricane Awareness Tour. And it's really disappointing that we were not able to hold that tour. And then eventually the tour the tour every year ends in Puerto Rico on that final day, where we usually get thousands of people to come out. They get to see the aircraft, again, learn about hurricanes and hurricane preparedness. And I know this year we're not able to do that as their outreach that we typically do. Maybe you can describe to people what that event's like, how it goes on, how everyone has really supported that. And again, hopefully a year from now, we can make that all happen again.
Sure, Dan.
Oh, you might be on mute.
Can you hear me now? No, I'm good. Well, yeah, every year we bring the hurricane hunters down to Puerto Rico. After Maria, we did it in Ceiba, and then we went to Aguadilla. But this year they asked me to do it in Ponce. well, Ponce was very affected by the earthquakes at the beginning of the year. So around February, we decided to move back to Aguadilla again. But now, because of the coronavirus, we had to like completely suspend the activity. But the activity is awesome because it's not only people can see the airplanes, they can also interact with the specialists and the pilots and the captains of their aircraft. Last year, we brought the NOAA aircraft also. They haven't been here for 10 years. So it was pretty cool for everybody to see all the scientists that work on this aircraft. Next year, hopefully it happens. We're gonna try to do it at some place in Puerto Rico. Right now, I don't know, but we need that activity because that outreach activity brings a lot of people that are very interested, and that we take advantage of this activity to the danger of hurricane.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most disappointing things for all of us this year is that we haven't been able to do a lot of our outreach that we typically do leading up to Hurricane Center. But it's really helped us to bring this to you all. So hopefully you all are thankful and found this very enjoyable to be able to listen to us today and learn about hurricanes. Because again, it's the one way we've been able to continue to talk about the upcoming hurricane season is through webinars like this. So I'll turn it back to you, Robbie, for the next question.
Yeah, so the next question that caught my eye was from Mia, and she asked, has any hurricanes passed by the National Hurricane Center? So I was gonna actually pass that to anybody here on the panel that wanted to talk about their experiences being in the Hurricane Center during a hurricane.
I guess I can start real quick in that I've been at the Hurricane Center since 1993 and had a few hurricanes come by. Thankfully, nothing has been extremely strong for us or extremely damaging. I moved to Miami a year after Hurricane Andrew. And so Andrew was very devastating for some of the folks that worked at the Hurricane Center. It was a Category 5 storm that made landfall about 20 miles south of where the Hurricane Center is located. And it did do some damage to folks, their homes. Since I've been there, I can remember experiencing a lot of flooding from Hurricane Irene in 1999. And then going through Hurricane Katrina as a Category 1. It was actually I passed right over the Hurricane Center as I was coming on shift. And then in 2005, also Hurricane Wilma. Hurricane Irma was certainly a big threat here and caused us to have to take a lot of actions. But again, thankfully, not a lot of damage personally to my home. But it shows we got to be ready each and every year. So I don't know, John, you may have some others to add or other experiences from those storms.
I'll just add one thing, Dan, about Hurricane Irma most recently. It did affect Miami. Fortunately, like Dan said, we were more in the rain bands, as we talked about earlier. We got about Category 1 attacks in Miami, but we were all at the center on lockdown. So all of us were in there and we couldn't leave while the hurricane was ongoing. And probably the most interesting thing is we were trying to figure out places to sleep when we were not shift, everybody. We don't have beds at the Hurricane Center. We're not really equipped to stay there much beyond our working hours. So I'll tell you personally, I was working overnight because, you know, one of the things about meteorology is work all times of day, right? I was working overnight and I was looking for a spot to sleep in the building when the hurricane was going. The only spot I can was inside the storage closet. So I slept with the printers and the papers and all things like that. And we couldn't, you know, we really wanted to know what was going on with the weather, but all the shutters were up, so we couldn't even see until the next day when we finally opened up the doors.
So Dan, I just saw a really interesting, cool question. I thought maybe I'd throw out to Ernesto. This is from Abigail, and she actually told a little story. She said she was in a hurricane. I'm going to guess it was Maria. She said, I live where the hurricane came in, Manalbo. We had crazy wind, not a lot of water. On the other side of the island where she has family, they didn't have the wind, but they had a lot of water, which caused floods. So how is it that you can have a hurricane hit the island and have such different weather on different sides of the island?
Well, it all depends on the interaction between the topography and the actual storm. Some storms are stronger on the north side of the storm, you know, the system, and other ones are weaker. So, and here during Maria, what we saw was that the stronger winds occur in the southeast Puerto Rico. But as you went to the northwest side of the island interior, the damage stopped being more from wind and more associated for all the water, all the rain we had, all the landslides and all the rain that they received, especially in the central and northwest portion of Puerto Rico. So the entire island saw the devastation associated to a hurricane, but they had different hazards affecting the islands. Okay, so that's something that have many people have brought me. You know, they feel they had a Cat 5 in the southwest portion of Puerto Rico, but in the southwest portion of Puerto Rico, probably they had a Cat 1. So nobody knew what was a Cat 5. So people have to understand that we categorize the hurricanes because of the winds. How strong are the winds? Rain is not considered for to classify a hurricane. And I know that the central Puerto Rico and northwest portion of Puerto Rico had a lot of devastation from Maria because of the rain. But when they see the final analysis of the hurricane, they saying, oh, we only had Cat 1 or Cat 2 winds. So every storm is going to be different. When I say this, is because none of them are all the same. So every storm are going to have their impacts, and therefore people have to be watching your forecast or the hurricane center of the track and the intensity of the storm, but they have to also focus on what the local office is saying. What's going to be the direct impact to the island and to the people?
Thanks, Ernesto. I saw a couple of interesting questions coming here toward the end. One, I think I'm going to throw to you, John, because I think of the panelists here, you probably work more with the research community than the rest of us, although we have some others at the Hurricane Center that do a lot of that work as well. But it asks here, it says, how do we actually do research in hurricanes? So I'll throw that one to you.
That's a really good question. Who asked this question, Dan? Did you have the name?
I think it's Juan, I think is the name.
Wow, a really, really, really good question. So there's many different ways to do research. We could do research through information that, for example, from data from the hurricane hunters, what they collect. When we're looking at the data, when it's coming in, we just take a really quick look because we don't have a lot of time to figure it out. But you could do research to really learn a lot more about what that data is telling us, how strong the storm is, its structure and shape, and you can just learn a lot about the science. Also, I think Andy earlier mentioned mentioned how we predict hurricanes through some of the models. These computer models give us information for prediction, but we can also do research using those models to learn about why they're predicting what they're predicting, and just to try to figure out how hurricanes really work. The amazing thing about this, guys, is that even though we're getting better and better at making these forecasts, we still have a lot to learn and we still make a lot of errors. So places of research, figuring out the science and figuring out all of our tools is still very much needed.
Hey, thanks, John. Another question here is not as much about hurricanes, but Raul was asking about how many years do you have to attend college in order to become a meteorologist? Because I'm sure there's a lot of kids on the webinar today that might be interested in getting into weather and learning more about weather. So I was going to pass this to Andy to talk about kind of a little bit about his education and becoming a meteorologist.
Sure, that's a great question. So personally, I ended up, at first I got a 4-year degree in college, meteorology at Florida State. I tried to apply for some jobs and I was unsuccessful. And so I went back and got my master's degree from Florida State as well. And I got into the National Weather Service as an intern in Flagstaff, Arizona. I have an interesting path to the Hurricane Center, really. We did a lot of winter weather forecasting before going to Ohio to do some severe weather forecasting before getting to the Hurricane Center in 2014. So 6 years in college overall, maybe 6.5 years. A lot of math, a lot of science, but applied research as well.
Thanks, Andy. I know we're getting short on time, but we'll try to get to a few more. So many great questions, really just fantastic questions. There's been a couple just in general about kind of how we work, if we have to work shift work 24/7 like the police officers. And yes, weather is always occurring. So those of us at the Hurricane Center, we work shift work during the hurricane season, have different folks staff different times of day so that we can put out those forecasts. We issue forecasts even in the middle of the night. So yeah, we are there. But they're also asking about, how is the building made so that we can survive the hurricanes if it hits? And Ernesto, I know you all have had experience with that with Maria and having to be able to sustain operations. So maybe you can share both, how you guys staff year round for weather that occurs anytime, and then also how you all had to deal with the aftermath of Maria and then continuing your operations there in Puerto Rico.
Well, normally what we have is 3 shifts during the day. One starts 6 in the morning, it goes up to 2 p.m., from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and the graveyard shift is 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. But normally we have at least 2 forecasters working. If we're expecting weather, we can increase the amount of people in the staff, or we can go through what we do during Maria or other hurricanes, is go to 12-hour shift. And we have around 4 to 5 forecasters working the system. During Maria, it was kind of different because Maria was not the only storm that affected us in less than 2 weeks. At 2017 year, we had Irma, then we had Jose, and then we had Maria. So we already tired with those 2 first storms. So when Maria came in, we knew what to do. Everybody moved to the office. More than half of the office were staying at the office. The office didn't have any damage. Like John said, we had storm shoulders all around the office. So the only way we can see the storm occurring was through a little camera we had on the parking space. Then we can see stuff flying around. So it was kind of incredible and scary at the same time.
Hey, thanks, Ernesto. Actually, I was going to throw the next one to you as well, kind of following on the education question. Lizette was asking, where in Puerto Rico can you study meteorology?
Well, in my time, I didn't have I had to go to the state to go to do my degree. But nowadays we have Mayagüez has some kind of program that can help you become a National Weather Service meteorologist. They do the minimum courses to be a employee in National Weather Service, and it's really good because Mayagüez is very competitive. So the students coming out from Mayagüez are really, really good. Right now we have 6 of our staff members are from this program, and they're really, really good. So they're preparing this forecast really good to do a great job like they're doing right now at the office.
Thanks, Ernesto. I have one. It might be the last question, but we might have time for maybe one more. But it's something I actually was thinking about going around the panel and maybe we all kind of answering. I think it's a really good question about, have you ever been wrong about a hurricane? And I think all of us as forecasters, we get humbled pretty quickly in our job that things don't always go as forecast. And certainly happened for me. One of the things we really try to do is make sure we communicate what we call uncertainty around that forecast. Mm-hmm. So we make a prediction, but we try to say, well, maybe it will be this strong or this strong. And I know for myself, I've been quite surprised more than once about the future intensity of a storm, and that it has strengthened quite a bit faster than what I predicted. So that's happened to me. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to share about when maybe you felt like you wish you would have made a better forecast.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ernesto. You
John.
go first. Oh, okay. Well, I have one from last year, and it involves the Puerto Rico, actually. So I remember forecasting a Hurricane Dorian when it was in the Caribbean, and I thought it was going to head toward the Dominican Republic, and was forecasting it to be a strong tropical storm or hurricane there, but instead it turned to the right and went right over the Virgin Islands, and I had a big error. And in fact, I remember it didn't message anything about the Virgin Islands even being potentially threatened. So that was one very recent one.
Yeah, I remember that, John. But the thing is, the important thing about being wrong is going back and looking why we were wrong. Okay, we have to go back and see what happened that we had a bad forecast. Because if we don't learn from our errors, we're going to continue doing that bad forecast. So every year for me is a learning experience for years to come.
I have a quick good example. It's actually the last storm of the Atlantic season this past year. I started the storm, initialized the advisories of the storm Sebastian, the last storm. I forecasted it to dissipate in a couple of days. Well, it turns out it lasted for several days. So models sometimes will say one thing and other things end up happening. And so you have to learn from what caused that and move forward with that.
Dan, I'm not sure if you want to wrap things up. Maybe time for one more question.
Yeah, why don't we do one more question, and then we'll wrap. I did see someone that said thanks very much, but they had to run to class, so I know folks are having to probably sign off. But let's take one more, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So one more question from Orlando. I think I saw this several times in here. Is what is La Nina and El Nino? It's a really good question. So John, I wonder if you could take that one.
Okay, sure, Robbie. And it's a really good question. I'll try to keep it quick. So first know that El Nino, La Nina are these big circulations that happen in the ocean over the Pacific Ocean. So it's far away from where we all live, but it has to do with the water temperatures and how they behave. And amazingly, how those water temperatures change in the Pacific Ocean from El Nino or La Nina affect weather patterns in the Atlantic. So obviously now when it's La Nina, it changes the wind shear to be really light in the Atlantic and allows hurricanes to have a better chance to get stronger and form. And when it's El Nino, it means that those resulting water patterns in the Pacific cause more wind shear in the Atlantic, and sometimes we get less hurricanes. Sorry, I couldn't give you a longer answer because that's a really tough question, but know that it has all to do with those water temperatures out in the Pacific Ocean.
So thanks, John, and just wanted to also again thank our panelists. Thanks, Robbie, John, Andy, Ernesto. We answered a lot of great questions today. I know, unfortunately, there were a lot more questions, a lot of great questions. We can't get to everything. If you enjoyed it, let us know. And also, there's still, I looked just a minute ago, there's still a few spots left for Thursdays, for Wednesday's Puerto Rico second webinar. So if you had some friends that couldn't join us today, you can let them know about it, and they can always join us on Wednesday. But again, really do appreciate everyone taking the time this morning. Hopefully you learned something this today, and hopefully you'll take some of that as we head toward hurricane season and make sure that you and your family are prepared as we head to the 2020 hurricane season. Anybody have any final words they want to say before we sign off?
I was going to say thanks for joining us today. We enjoyed your questions and hope you enjoyed this webinar.
Stay safe, everybody.
Likewise.
Stay home.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Ernesto, for joining us today. We'll see you again on Wednesday, and great job, everyone. We'll sign off. Thanks again. Have a safe 2020 hurricane season.
Bye, everybody.